There is a moment, somewhere deep in the middle of the 1970s, when the music industry thought it had rock figured out. 3 minutes, a verse and a chorus, radio-friendly, clean around the edges. There were unwritten laws and everyone followed them. And then 4 men from London walked into a studio with a 6-minute song that changed direction 3 times, had no chorus, included a full operatic interlude, referenced Scaramouche and Galileo in the same breath, and sent it to a record label that told them it would never get airplay. That song became one of the best-selling singles of all time. That band was Queen. And the story of how they got there, from a group of penniless students being laughed out of record offices to headlining one of the greatest concerts in human history, is actually what happens when people refuse to be shaped by the world they step into and decide instead to shape it themselves. Today we're going inside the real story of Queen, how they formed out of rejection, how they recorded music that broke every convention in the book, how they nearly fell apart right before their greatest triumph, and what they left behind that no other band has quite managed to replicate. This is going to be a good one. Stay with me all the way through. To understand Queen, you have to understand how improbable their existence was in the first place, because nothing about their individual stories pointed toward the same destination. They came from different corners of the world, different disciplines, different temperatures of personality. And yet something, luck, stubbornness, and an almost reckless appetite for sound, pulled them into the same orbit. Start with Brian May. Born in Hampton, Middlesex in 1947, May was the kind of teenager who built things when he couldn't afford to buy them. At 16 years old, realizing he couldn't afford a proper Fender or Gibson guitar, he and his father Harold spent 18 months constructing what would become one of the most famous instruments in rock history, the Red Special. The neck came from the wood of a fireplace mantel that a family friend was about to throw away. The tremolo arm was fashioned from a bicycle saddlebag. The body was made from blockboard, with the wormholes in the old wood filled in with matchsticks. They finished it in October 1964. Brian May has played that handmade guitar on every single Queen album and almost every concert of his career. When he couldn't afford something, he built something better. Then there was Roger Taylor, born in Norfolk in 1949, a young dental student turned drummer who auditioned for May's college band Smile by reading an ad on a notice board asking for a Mitch Mitchell or Ginger Baker type drummer. He got the job. Roger Taylor was many things: charming, ambitious, occasionally combustible. But above all, he was a drummer with instinct and power that felt larger than the kit he was playing. And then, drifting into their world like something between a comet and a stray cat, came Farrokh Bulsara. Born in Zanzibar in 1946 to Indian Parsi parents, he had attended boarding school in India as a child, developed a love of music and art that nobody around him quite understood, and emigrated to England with his family in 1964. By the time he found his way to Ealing College of Art in West London, he had acquired the English name Freddie, developed a taste for fashion so flamboyant it bordered on performance art, and built up a restlessness that seemed to have no proper outlet. He found Smile through mutual friends, he watched them play, he followed them around to gigs, offered unsolicited advice about their stage presence, and lobbied, not quietly, to become their lead singer. He moved in with them after college. He was, in Brian May's words, unnerving at first, running around, screaming, posing, making the kind of spectacle that made the others wonder whether this was going to work. But he was also electric, and interesting, and impossible to ignore. When Smile's original lead singer Tim Staffel left in early 1970, the decision that had been hovering in the background finally landed. Mercury, May and Taylor agreed to move forward together, and it was Freddie who named them. He wanted something simple, regal, and memorable. A word that non-English speakers could say, a word that carried weight. He chose Queen. Then he changed his own name to Freddie Mercury, after the Roman god, messenger of the gods, quick and untouchable. The transformation was complete. The final piece arrived in February 1971 at a London disco of all places. A mutual friend introduced May and Taylor to a quiet electronics student from Leicester named John Deacon. He was the youngest, the most reserved, and in many ways the steadiest of the four. He auditioned in a lecture room at Imperial College, and within a few days became the bass player. His real contribution would reveal itself over time, not just in his bass lines, but in the tiny homemade amplifier he built in his bedroom that Brian May would use for decades to create guitar tones that sounded like nothing else on earth. What followed was not immediate glory, not even close. The early years of Queen were a sustained lesson in rejection. They recorded demos at Delaney Studios, and with those tapes in hand, they went to every record label they could find. Not one of them said yes. Some said come back in a few years, others simply showed them the door. In a recent interview, Brian May recalled those days with the kind of clarity that only comes from having survived them. It was a fight to get into a studio. It was a fight to get our own way. It was a fight to get it released, and then it got completely slaughtered by the music press. And he wasn't exaggerating. When their self-titled debut finally came out in 1973 through a deal with Trident Audio Productions and EMI, the critical response ranged from lukewarm to hostile. The British music press in the early 70s was not a forgiving place, especially for a band that wore its ambitions this openly. Queen were too theatrical, too polished, too layered. In an era when rawness was a virtue, they came armed with orchestral arrangements, multi-tracked harmonies, and a guitarist who treated his instrument as a one-man string section. Freddie Mercury himself wasn't fully formed yet either. Brian May has spoken publicly about how, when Mercury first walked into the recording studio, his voice was, in May's words, out of control. The raw energy that made him so electric on stage translated into vocal performances that were scattered and undisciplined on tape. But here is what mattered. Freddie heard it too. He refused to accept the first 4 tracks they laid down. He went back and back again, listening, adjusting, moulding himself with the same obsessive precision he would later bring to every Queen record. By the time they reached their landmark albums a few years later, the singer Brian May would describe as being like a metronome with a lot of balls, had already forged himself into something singular. Their second album, Queen 2, finally gave them a foothold in the UK charts in 1974. Their third, Sheer Heart Attack, later that same year, broke through internationally. The momentum was building, and it was all pointing toward the most audacious thing they had yet attempted. A song Freddie had been carrying around in his head for years, built from scraps of paper and fragments of melody that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to become real. The first person outside the band to hear any part of Bohemian Rhapsody was producer Roy Thomas Baker. The occasion was a dinner invitation. Baker had arrived at Mercury's Kensington flat one evening, and before they left to eat, Freddie sat down at the piano and played the opening ballad section. Then he stopped. "And this is where the opera section comes in," he announced quite calmly. Then they went out to dinner. What became Bohemian Rhapsody had roots going back to Freddie's days as a student at Ealing Art College in the late 1960s. A piece he called The Cowboy Song contained an early version of the lyric "Mama just killed a man." For years he carried the idea in pieces, on scraps of paper from his father's office, on post-it notes, in his own head. When he finally walked into rehearsal with it in 1975, he had the entire architecture already built. Brian May recalled him coming in with those little pieces of paper, playing the song section by section, explaining where the gaps were, describing what would go in each space. It was all in Freddie's mind, May said simply. Recording began on August 24th, 1975 at Rockfield Studios in Monmouth, Wales, and it would take 3 weeks for that song alone. In those 3 weeks, Mercury, May, and Roger Taylor sang their vocal parts for 10 to 12 hours a day. The opera section, the part that contains Scaramouche, Galileo, Bismillah, and the thunderous "No, We Will Not Let You Go," began as a few seconds of interlude and grew as Freddie kept arriving with more ideas, more layers, more Galileos, into a full operatic passage that required over 180 separate vocal overdubs. The recording tape itself began to wear thin from being run through the machine so many times. May recalled holding a section of tape up to the light and being able to see straight through it. The music had practically been worn off. Every time Freddie added a new element, something else got a little thinner. When it was all assembled, the gentle a cappella opening, the piano ballad, the full operatic chaos, and the hard rock climax, producer Roy Thomas Baker stood at the back of the control room and heard it as a complete piece for the first time. In his own words, "You just knew that you were listening for the first time to a big page in history." And yet Queen's label was deeply reluctant to release it as a single. It ran nearly 6 minutes, almost twice the length considered viable for radio at that time. They were told it would never get airplay. What changed everything was a DJ named Kenny Everett, a friend of Mercury's, who received an advance copy and made a decision that would shape rock history. He played Bohemian Rhapsody on his Capital radio show 14 times in a single weekend. By Monday morning, record stores across London were being flooded with requests. EMI released it in full. It went to number 1 in the UK and stayed there for 9 weeks. The accompanying music video, shot in just 3 hours at Elstree Studios for roughly £3,500, essentially invented the modern music video format 5 years before MTV even existed. When the song was re-released after Mercury's passing in 1991, it hit number 1 again. It remains the only UK single ever to reach number 1 in 4 different calendar years. And when it turned up in the 1992 film Wayne's World, 2 characters headbanging in a car, it introduced the song to an entirely new generation who had never heard of Queen. A scientific study conducted in 2011 determined Bohemian Rhapsody was the most contagious song ever written. The researchers were late to the party by about 30 years. Not everything Queen created was operatic and architecturally complex. Sometimes the most powerful songs are built from the simplest instincts. In May 1977, Queen were performing at Bingley Hall in Stafford, England, during their A-Day at the Races tour. When the concert ended, something unexpected happened. The crowd, without any prompting, began to sing. Not a Queen song, they sang You'll Never Walk Alone, the anthem long associated with Liverpool football, and with the act of tens of thousands of people becoming one voice. Brian May later recalled the moment as almost overwhelming. The band stood on stage and listened to 72,000 people singing back to them. It was, he said, quite an emotional experience. That night planted the seed for what would become 2 of the most recognised songs ever recorded. After the tour ended, May and Mercury each went away and independently wrote what they thought the band needed, a song that an entire stadium could participate in, a song that belonged not just to Queen but to everyone in the room. Brian May's contribution was built on a stomp and a clap. No bass, no traditional rhythm section, just the sound of human bodies creating percussion. He used his astrophysics background to engineer a delay system that made 4 people sound like an entire arena, overdubbing the stomps and claps with carefully timed delays so the sound spread across the stereo field like a crowd thousands strong. The result was We Will Rock You, which was almost entirely an a cappella song. Brian May, one of rock's most celebrated guitarists, wrote a hit song where he barely plays guitar until the final 30 seconds. Freddie Mercury's contribution was a different kind of statement. He later said he was thinking about football when he wrote it, about the feeling of defiance, of having faced everything thrown at you and still standing. We Are the Champions became his version of a personal anthem, though he intended it as a collective one. The we in the title refers to everyone who is singing it, he explained. A team of researchers at the University of London's Goldsmiths College named it the catchiest song in the history of popular music in 2011. Both songs opened the band's 6th studio album, News of the World, released in October 1977, and they have been virtually inseparable ever since, closing concerts, opening sporting events, used at FIFA World Cups, NBA Finals, Super Bowls, and, memorably, played at Buckingham Palace during Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. Most people who have heard these songs do not know who wrote them. They feel like they have always existed, part of some shared human vocabulary that predates the people who created them. Brian May has said this is the finest compliment a songwriter can receive. When a song stops belonging to its author and starts belonging to the world, something genuinely rare has happened. By 1985, Queen were in trouble. Not commercially ruined, they could still fill stadiums, but creatively drifting and personally fractured. Their last 3 American albums had failed to crack the top 20 on the US charts. The 1982 album Hot Space had caused serious internal friction, with Mercury and John Deacon pulling toward funk and soul, while May and Taylor wanted to stay rooted in rock. Mercury had gone off to record a solo album, Mr. Bad Guy. The band had not performed live together in over a year. Brian May later admitted, Freddie had stepped so far away, I thought we might not get him back. Into this situation came an invitation from Bob Geldof, who was organising Live Aid, a massive charity concert to raise funds for famine relief in Ethiopia. Queen almost said no. They were exhausted from touring, uncertain about their standing, and Mercury reportedly shrugged and said, I'm a bit old. Roger Taylor was the only one immediately enthusiastic. It was Brian May who eventually turned things around by going to Freddie and saying simply, "If we wake up the day after this show and we haven't been there, we're going to be pretty sad." Mercury's response apparently was, "Oh, all right." What almost nobody knew on July 13th, 1985, as Queen took the stage at Wembley in the early evening, was that Mercury had been dealing with serious vocal problems that day. A doctor had told him not to perform. He performed anyway. Promoter Harvey Goldsmith has since revealed that he had to fight Bob Geldof to get Queen on the bill at all. Geldof initially thought they were past their peak. Goldsmith held firm. He knew what Freddie Mercury could do with a crowd of 72,000 people and an estimated 1 billion watching around the world. He was right in a way that exceeded anyone's expectations. Mercury jogged onto the stage in white jeans and a sleeveless top, sat down at a grand piano, and opened with a compressed version of Bohemian Rhapsody. What followed, in the next 21 minutes, has been voted by industry polls as the greatest live rock performance in history. During Radio Gaga, he got the entire stadium to perform the synchronized clapping pattern from the song's music video, 72,000 people moving in unison. Then, between songs, he did something that made time seem to slow down. He walked to the front of the stage, faced the crowd, opened his mouth, and started a call and response. "Ayo!" The crowd sent it back. He pushed it higher. They followed. He went higher still. They followed again. That exchange, broadcast live to 1 billion people across the planet, is now known simply as the note heard around the world. When he came off stage afterward, his first words were, "Thank God that's over." Then Elton John found him outside his trailer and said simply, "You bastards." Bob Geldof's verdict. Queen were absolutely the best band of the day. They played the best, had the best sound, used their time to the full. It was the perfect stage for Freddie, the whole world. Within days of the concert, Queen's Greatest Hits album rose 55 places in the UK charts. A band that had been stalling had just given the greatest performance of their lives in front of every human being on earth with a television set. And Freddie Mercury, who had been told that morning to rest his voice, had just redefined what a live show could be. What came after Live Aid was a resurgence. New tours, new records, stadiums packed to capacity. In August 1986, over 120,000 people filled Nebworth Park for what turned out to be Queen's final concert with Mercury. He appeared at the end in a crown and robe, bowing to the crowd. Roadie Peter Hintz later said he felt that night like it was the last time for all of them. Mercury himself told May backstage, "I'm not going to be doing this forever. This is probably the last time." He already knew. Freddie Mercury had been officially diagnosed with AIDS in 1987, though evidence suggests he had been carrying the virus since at least the early 1980s. He told almost no one. He did not want people buying Queen records out of sympathy. He did not want the world's grief intruding on the time he had left. He told the band members, who then closed ranks around him, lying to journalists, to families, to almost everyone, and continued to make music for as long as he could. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Mercury would come into the studio for an hour or two at a time whenever he had the energy and record every vocal he could. He knew what he was doing. He told manager Jim Beach before he passed, "Get me to sing anything, write me anything, and I will sing it. I will leave you as much as I possibly can." The result was the album Made in Heaven, released posthumously in 1995, assembled from Mercury's final recordings by the remaining 3 members. His last recorded vocal was on a song called Mother Love. He completed all but the final verse before he had to stop, and it was left incomplete, fading into a brief instrumental passage. Brian May has spoken about the song The Show Must Go On with particular emotion. He brought Mercury the track when the singer was barely able to leave his bed. Mercury was in severe physical decline. May wasn't sure he could manage it. Mercury drank a large vodka, walked into the studio and delivered one of the most powerful performances of his career. The lyric, "Inside my heart is breaking, my makeup may be flaking, but my smile still stays on," was not metaphor. It was documentary. On November 23, 1991, Mercury issued a public statement confirming what many had long suspected. He had AIDS. 24 hours later, he was gone. He was 45 years old. In April 1992, the Freddie Mercury tribute concert filled Wembley Stadium in 5 hours of sold-out ticket sales and was watched by an estimated 1.2 billion viewers worldwide. Elton John, David Bowie, George Michael, Robert Plant, Annie Lennox, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, they all came. The remaining members of Queen performed. The Guinness Book of Records later listed it as the largest rockstar benefit concert in history. It raised over £20 million for AIDS charities and helped shift the public conversation around the disease at a moment when the world desperately needed that shift. Mercury's death was, at the time, the most high-profile AIDS-related loss the world had seen. It forced a generation of people who had turned away from the epidemic to look directly at it, pull back far enough, and the scale of what Queen left behind becomes almost hard to process. They sold somewhere between 250 and 300 million records worldwide. Their 1981 Greatest Hits album is the best-selling album in UK chart history, certified 9 times platinum in the United States. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001. The US Library of Congress added Bohemian Rhapsody to its National Recording Registry in 2022. Each of the 4 members was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, an extraordinary distinction that reflects just how completely songwriting was shared across the band. Mercury wrote Bohemian Rhapsody, Killer Queen, Somebody to Love, Don't Stop Me Now, and We Are the Champions. May wrote We Will Rock You, Tie Your Mother Down, and Too Much Love Will Kill You. Deacon gave the world Another One Bites the Dust, You're My Best Friend, and I Want to Break Free. Even Roger Taylor wrote Radio Gaga and A Kind of Magic. This was not a band with 1 songwriter and 3 hired hands. All 4 of them could write a #1 hit. Beyond the statistics, what Queen changed was the permission structure of rock music. They proved that grandeur was not pretension, that camp and power could inhabit the same song, that classical structure and heavy guitar and music hall theatrics and funk and disco could all live together inside one band's catalogue without any of it feeling incoherent. They made rock music bigger in every sense, bigger sonically, bigger emotionally, bigger in ambition, and in doing so gave every artist who came after them a wider sense of what was possible. Eric Clapton said Mercury rewrote the language of what a frontman could be. Keith Richards said of Bohemian Rhapsody, I thought there were 2 people playing at once. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys called it a fulfillment of a teenage prayer, artistic music. Dave Grohl has cited them among his deepest influences. Lady Gaga, Mika, Adam Lambert. The list of artists who carry Queen's DNA in their work is long and growing. John Deacon retired from music in 1997, saying simply that there was no Queen without Freddie Mercury, and he meant it. Brian May eventually completed his PhD in astrophysics, the one he had abandoned for rock stardom, earning his doctorate from Imperial College in 2007, 36 years after walking away from academia to make something that mattered more. Roger Taylor still performs, and the songs, all those songs built on argument and obsession and handmade guitars and operatic ambition and late nights in studios where the tape wore thin, those songs show no sign of going anywhere. Queen did not follow the rules of rock music. They studied those rules long enough to understand which ones were worth ignoring, and then they walked away from almost all of them. If you find yourself thinking about 4 extraordinary people who built something that refused to stay inside the frame they were given, drop a comment and let me know which part of Queen's story hit you hardest. Also name 3 of your favourite Queen songs.